Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is June 22nd, 2021, and it is my pleasure to have with me today my friend Jessica Montel, who is the head of the Israeli NGO Hamoked. Jessica, as I said, she's the executive director of Hamoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual. She has been a leading figure in Israeli civil society for 2 decades, and frankly, she has been one of my, lighthouses in learning these issues. For 13 years, she headed B'Tselem, the human rights organization. She left in 2014 and was the founding director of another organization called SISO, Save Israel, Stop the Occupation. And in 2011, she was selected by Haaretz as, quote, one of the year's 10 most influential Anglo immigrants. She is a frequent commentator, frequent speaker, frequent writer, and truly one of the most expert people when it comes to international law, human rights, Israel, the occupation, and all of those wonderful things. You can follow her at Jessica Montel on Twitter, and you can check out the organization at www.hamoked, HAMOKED.org. So with that, we're going to get right into it. Jessica, so collective punishment, which is what we're here to talk about today. Collective punishment is a perennial topic for those of us who follow Israel's practices vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. It always has been an issue, and there are many facets to these practices. Today, we're going to focus on one specific element of collective punishment, and that is the demolition of homes, of families, of people who are arrested or convicted of terrorism. And the reason we're talking about this today is the case of the Shalabi family from Turmosaya in the West Bank. So as we're going, we will have a link posted with this podcast to an article from the Associated Press, which covers a lot of this. Hamoked is representing the family. So Jessica, if you want to just take some time and tell us this story, because it's almost as if you wanted to create an encyclopedia entry for all of the problems with collective punishment and home demolitions. It's like this would be the definition that they would create and put into the dictionary, the encyclopedia. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you for having me and for addressing this really important issue. So the story of this family and this legal case starts when the husband of the family is suspected of perpetrating a drive-by shooting in the West Bank at the beginning of May, and an Israeli was killed and 2 others were injured. So he has been arrested, charged, he's on trial. But then the military has issued a demolition order for the family home in Turmosaya. It's a 2-story big family home. And this is because it's a standard practice, basically. Anytime a Palestinian kills an Israeli, to not only criminally punish the perpetrator, but to demolish the family's home. So in this case, it's a very unique situation because the perpetrator is not even living in that house. He spends most of his time in the United States, and he comes home only 1 month a year back to the West Bank. So the person living in that house is Sana Shalabi and her 3 children, who are not suspected of even knowing about, much less supporting or taking any part in this attack. And there's another, that makes the demolition from a legal perspective even more ridiculous, is that the perpetrator, Muntasar Shalabi, also suffered from mental illness, was taking antipsychotic drugs, had been treated by a psychiatrist, was institutionalized previously. So the idea that, not only he's responsible for his actions, but that somehow he is the case that you can demolish the whole family's house in order to, the rationalization for these demolitions is that it's going to deter other people from carrying out these attacks, right? It's a deterrent. You are intentionally harming innocent people in order to deter other people from carrying out these attacks. We can talk a little bit about, whether it's actually effective. whether it's justified, even it's not effective. But certainly in this case, where he doesn't even live there and he has mental illness, it seems like, a crazy case. And I would add the third important biographical details, that the whole family are US citizens. So we're talking about a US citizen, Sana Shalabi, and her 3 children that live in that house. Also relevant when you think about US policy toward Israel. The US State Department is opposed in general to these home demolitions. The question is whether they would go beyond that sort of bland statement of opposition to actually take measures to ensure that a US citizen and her 3 American children don't lose their home because of this policy.
So thank you. I want to circle back to the American part in a bit, but just to dig in a little bit. So effectively, this is a case where you have the alleged perpetrator, who, by the way, has not yet been convicted. It's still alleged. He hasn't been tried or convicted yet. The alleged perpetrator doesn't live in the home. He lives in the United States. He's effectively estranged from his wife and kids. He has mental illness and almost no contact. And so they're effectively alleging that either there is some guilt by association, which is difficult to see here, or that somehow it will send a message to him and people like him by punishing people who are at this great distance. So just to get that right there.
That's right. There's no allegation that they are in any way involved. It is an intentional policy of harming innocent people, so that other people will see that and not engage in attacks, because they don't want, theoretically, they're not going to take part in attacks, so that their own family members won't be similarly harmed.
Okay, so let's pull the camera back from the Shalabis for a second and talk about collective punishment as a concept, because collective punishment isn't just a term of art used by human rights organizations, right? It actually has legal meaning under international law. And in the Israeli context, there's very specific understanding of what it does or doesn't mean. Can you talk about why and how Israel has come to adopt quite openly a policy of collective punishment, punishing people, as you said, where there isn't even a suspicion or an implied accusation that the people who will suffer from this act are the ones who did anything illegal, right? I mean, we have cases where the people whose home is you have someone who was killed in the act of committing an act of terror, and then his family is punished after his death by demolishing his home. That isn't about punishing them for terrorism. So how did this come about? How did it become accepted legally in Israel, and how does it line up against international law and international practice?
So you're right that there are a lot of policies that we invoke this term collective punishment. To my mind, this is the most, blatant policy, again, of willfully harming innocent people. And the power to use these home demolitions is a legacy that we inherited from the British mandate. It's an emergency order from pre-state Palestine, where the British use this policy. It's called the Regulation 119. So it comes, it was enacted before, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and, this whole system of human rights law. But I think it's not, the principle against collective punishment is not complicated. You have in the Fourth Geneva Convention a principle that is in every legal system, going back to the Bible, that says you don't punish people for something that they have not done. So that's the framing of it, that explicit prohibition on collective punishment in the Fourth Geneva Convention. But it's just obvious that you don't, punish people for, even if they're related to the criminal or, have some other affiliation with the criminal. Each of us is responsible for our own actions. We are held accountable for our own actions, not for actions of other people. That's, I think, common sense entrenched in every legal system and also in the Fourth Geneva Convention. You have a second principle in the Fourth Geneva Convention that prohibits the occupying power, Israel, from demolishing property in general. And we have a lot of different kinds of home demolitions that we are criticizing Israel for because they violate that principle, including this one. So those are the two relevant provisions in international humanitarian law, which is governing occupied territory, like the situation in the West Bank. Now, you have had many legal challenges to this in the Israeli system. And the current situation is, we have gone to the High Court 75 times since 2014 when the policy was renewed. We succeeded in having a moratorium for about 10 years on this policy, partly because the military itself raised questions about whether or not it was even effective and suggested that, in fact, it achieves the opposite. It's, in fact, encouraging people. It's a source of antagonism to the military and a trigger for people wanting to attack Israelis. But anyway, the policy was renewed in 2014. Since that time, we've petitioned the High Court 75 times, and we are challenging, the whole policy as collective punishment. There is no justification. It's illegal, both according to Israeli law and international law and these common principles of justice. And we have had an impossible time in the High Court getting a substantive ruling. So we've won some cases. I think it's 8 cases that we succeeded in canceling demolition orders, but it's always on the specifics of the individual case. Too much time has passed. They didn't own the house. They were just renting the house. I mean, all sorts of technicalities. One case of that the perpetrator had mental illness, was schizophrenic, and then the demolition order was canceled. But the court has said we're not going to get into the principle of whether Regulation 119 is legal. I mean, what they're saying is there is a precedent because we've been doing it for so long and we've had so many cases to the court. There's no point in reopening. But, really, there has never been a substantive discussion. And of course, many things have happened. Israel joining the International Criminal Court, Palestine joining the International Criminal Court. You now have an open investigation where this would certainly be relevant in terms of considering crimes being committed in the territory of Palestine. And still, the court is not willing to engage with the legality as a whole. So all we are left with is arguing the specifics of the case, that Muntasar Shalabi didn't live in the house, as I said, that he has mental illness, all of those things that, we hope would save this house. I mean, there is a hope that one case and another case and another case sets some sort of precedent. You can't have a blank check to be demolishing houses. But so far, we have been unsuccessful in having the international legal discussion that I think is really crucial.
It's interesting. You've brought up in that, and thank you for that. Your answer includes a lot of you just sort of things that are actually quite important that people may not know, like the fact that 53 years into the occupation, Israel is still using emergency regulations, the emergency regulations inherited from the British for the temporary occupation that's 53 years long. And it also underscores something that I think has been getting more attention as we've had this discussion of the word apartheid, which is that you have different sets of laws and rules applying to different people, emergency regulations to govern Palestinians in the West Bank side by settlers who live with all the rights and protections of Israeli law. What you said about this coming up in court and experts saying it's not effective as a deterrent has always been striking to me, because that's the one argument in favor of doing this, is that it's a deterrent, whether it's legal, whether it's moral, whether it's right. It's sort of like, that you've got that terrible choice. If we have to make one person suffer so 100 people don't suffer, that kind of moral
right
conundrum, and that doesn't hold up. One very simple question I have to ask you, which I thought of, is, we're constantly hearing from defenders of status quo occupation, Israel policies, that, these damn human rights groups, they want to hold Israel to a different standard, a higher standard than the rest of the world. Is there any other democracy that has rule of law that you know of that has a policy of collective punishment of civilians? as part of their legal system, because I can't think of any country in the world
No.
where if my boyfriend commits a crime, they can come and demolish my house or my husband.
Right. Right. I think that's right. I also cannot think. And, Israel is very unique in that you have atrocities being committed around the world by autocratic dictatorships with no legal basis. Israel, everything is legal, quote unquote, legal. There are regulations, there are policies, there are procedures for things that are blatantly illegal. But, I remember the Amnesty researcher who came here in the 80s that says, most countries are torturing, but nobody's going to admit it. But Israel, there was a whole legal framework to be governing even something as completely illegitimate as torture. Of course, they had other euphemisms for it, but, the basic principle that things that are blatantly illegal are being conducted according to a legal system, and you have legal advisors that come before the high court and present, and the high court rules on it and says, yes, in this case, it's okay. So that is a really, crazy situation of things that are blatantly wrong being conducted with this cloak of legality.
And I remember when I first came to Jerusalem in the 90s, and I was talking to a human rights monitor activist who was explaining to me the difference between rule of law and rule by law, and the idea that you can make laws to make anything legal, but that isn't rule of law. I mean, when the laws are being written to implement and support what a governing body wants to do against a minority population, then it's a different thing entirely. So let's talk a little bit more about the cases. You mentioned that the High Court has been reluctant to weigh in on the principle. And this is something that I think is a common theme with cases that are brought before the High Court of Justice in Israel, challenging the various practices that uphold occupation, right? You can whittle away on the margins, you can get technical rulings, you can, get the court basically saying to the Israeli government, I don't think you can defend this, do something else so that we don't have to rule against you, that kind of thing. Why do you think the Supreme Court is so reluctant to weigh in, even when you have an example? Again, this feels like a textbook example that you could bring before the court to say, if you can't support this, then you have to recognize that the underlying practice is the problem. It isn't the technicalities. We put it all together in a simple package here that shows why this is indefensible. You've done this, you've worked with the Supreme Court on these things for years. Why do you think this is so difficult for the court to weigh in on, even when the rulings are pretty clear, right?
Yes. First, we have to recognize that the court has gotten increasingly hostile to human rights over the years, that you have judicial appointments, primarily under Ayelet Shaked when she was justice minister, very right-wing, ultra-nationalist, settler judges. That has changed the composition of the court a bit, and the willingness to be engaging in these issues. I mean, it was never great before. I think you have a lot of different dynamics going on. Number one, so many things are justified in the name of security. It's very difficult to expect the court to step in and stop practices that are supposed to be keeping us safe. And in every court hearing on these cases, you have bereaved families that ask to address the court, even though they're not supposed to be a party to the proceedings, right? It's not supposed to be vengeance for the death of their loved one. It's something completely different, theoretically. But here you see that there's, this element also of the vengeance. It is rare. Let's say in the United States, it's very difficult to get to the Supreme Court with a case. So on the one hand, the Israeli High Court is very open, right? Every case you file, they have to hear it. And also cases of Palestinians in occupied territory, things that are taking place, outside the state of Israel. And yet when it comes to, as you said, actually intervening, it's extremely rare that the court is going to halt abusive, illegal policies. we win a majority of our cases, but as you said, either it's the individual case or the state itself capitulates before you get a ruling. By asking for more information, by raising the challenges, by conducting the discussion, it is more often the case that the state will change its policies before the high court ruling. When we get a high court ruling on, big principled issues, more often than not, we lose. And I think that reflects, Chief Justice Aaron Barak said, we live in this society. We are judging from within the society that we live in. And then all of the dynamics around Israeli treatment of Palestinians, that we have become so used to occupation and what that means in terms of two different legal systems for Jews and for Palestinians. The court just reflects many of those same dynamics rather than being in a position to voice a critique and stop those policies.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, for people who are unaware, for years, the Supreme Court in Israel is the court of first jurisdiction for Palestinians, in effect, but that's not, for people who think, oh, that means that proves that the Israeli system takes the grievances of Palestinians so seriously. That's not why it has historically been the court of first jurisdiction. It's been the court of first jurisdiction because it is legally anomalous, to say the least, to have the court system of a sovereign country dealing with cases that are located outside of its sovereign borders. That is such a bizarre situation. And it's worth noting that under Ayelet Shaket's leadership, that has actually largely been shifted. So the Palestinians are now, when they have claims against settlers, forced to go through the Jerusalem court system as if they were citizens. So they now are forced to actually contend with all of the layers of Israeli judicial bureaucracy while they do not enjoy the rights and benefits of being actual citizens to which the judicial system is accountable. So it's anomalous.
Right, that's right.
Possible way. So being respectful of your time, I know you're really busy and I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today. I want you to do that looking ahead thing. I'm first of all curious if you have anything to say about the United States and the engagement of the Biden administration. And I don't know if there's engagement that is behind the scenes and quiet. I have to hope there is. I haven't seen anything public. One would think that in a case where you have, a family, right, a mother and children who are American citizens under the threat of grievous collective punishment, that you would have the US weighing in. I would note that historically the track record of the US government weighing in on behalf of Palestinians whose lands, whose property, who've been arrested in the West Bank has been extraordinarily weak. And this is something I followed for many, many years. Do you see engagement coming from the Biden administration? That's the first question. And do you think it can make a difference? And the second question, as this legal case sort of, comes to a head with a new government in Israel, which in theory has a slightly less ideologically right-wing coloration, at least more complex coloration. Obviously, Mr. Bennett is not a lefty by any means, and nor is Yair Lapid, but still, that's part of their identity. And coming into that role with the Biden administration in Washington, do you think the court is more sensitive to those dynamics? Do you think there is the state of Israel is more ready to maybe either walk back this particular case so this family does not suffer, or actually examine whether or not they want to be on the list of countries that all the rest of which are not democracies, which engage openly in collective punishment of innocent people?
So I think you're right. We have, we have two fronts that we're waging this battle. The High Court heard the hearing, heard our case on Thursday. So we're waiting any day now for the judgment. I do not think that the new government or concerns about the Biden administration are going to influence the judges, although you had representatives of the US Embassy and other diplomats in the room. The judges were interested, who's present in the room. It seemed like we had a little more time and patience to be arguing our case than we normally do. And maybe that's the fact that we had diplomats there. But we're waiting any day now for the ruling. Again, I think our case on its merits is really strong, and maybe the High Court would stop the demolition. If the High Court gives the green light, the government doesn't have to demolish the house. And then I think the diplomatic battle is crucial. The fact that we have a new government, we have a new foreign minister who says that he wants to rehabilitate relations with the international community, with the US, with the Biden administration. So then it would be crucial that the US government speak out against. The State Department has said that they are opposed to punitive home demolitions, full stop, regardless of the fact that it's a US citizen. You know, a whole family should not lose their house because of the actions of one person. That's the official statement of the State Department. So here is an opportunity, you know, to go beyond that declarative opposition and speak up. And as you said, they are not always willing to go to bat for the rights of their own citizens when you're talking about Palestinians that are victims of Israeli policy. But I think even if we lose in the High Court, or especially if we lose in the High Court, then it's crucial that the Biden administration say, we are opposed to this policy and we expect you not to demolish the home of innocent US citizens. And I would think that the new government would be more receptive to that message.
So I lied, I have one more question. You mentioned the ICC a second ago, or a minute ago. How do you see policies like this fitting into the considerations of what Israel is most concerned will be investigated by the ICC? There's been discussions that even if they don't look at Gaza so much, the bigger concern is that they'll look at the settlement enterprise and related policies, which has to include collective punishment, which is, you know, brazen violation of international human rights law. And here I'm also thinking about the general focus. I mean, Tor Mosiah, the village that this house is in, which is a village of largely joint Palestinian American citizens, is right in the center of an area that is under intense pressure by settlers, right? We have constant land being taken, new settler ranches and agricultural, you know, work being done. Dror Etkes is tracking this, and Yesh Din. I mean, this in some ways, whether not about this particular home demolition threat, but this home is sort of at the epicenter of a lot of currents in the West Bank, which correlate to when people are saying we need international legal recourse because there's nothing else
Right.
that can help the Palestinians. So how do you see this sort of setting up with the ICC case?
So I would say two things. First, as you say, nothing can be divorced from the broader context. And this particular case, I mean, it's like a train wreck of human rights violations. So first, the attack where Muntasar Shalabi killed an Israeli civilian. In response to that attack, settlers set up an outpost on Beta village lands. So you have a new illegal settlement outpost as a result of the attack. Now you have Palestinian protests against the takeover of their land for that outpost. You know, every Friday, Palestinians are being injured and killed in those protests against the new settlement. So, I mean, as you said, it's, you know, a whole ecosystem of violations of rights. And regarding the ICC, I think there are two questions. One, the first purpose of the ICC is to ensure domestic accountability, or, you know, it's either accountability or deterrence. So I would hope that, and of course, Israel is following everything that's happening at the ICC very closely. So I would think it would be enough for the ICC to be looking into the issue of punitive home demolitions. That would send a very strong signal to Israel. And I think it's twofold. What we have said to the High Court is, in this situation, your legal guidance is needed. Military commanders are issuing demolition orders. Are they criminals? Soldiers are carrying out these demolitions. Are they criminals? So, you know, by refusing to deal with the legality of the whole policy, the High Court is really leaving the military sort of to fend for themselves in this legal arena. And so, as I said, I think one is the hope that ICC engagement would be a deterrent to Israel. But if not, I agree with you that, some cases are very hard to investigate and to identify who are the suspects and to bring them to trial. And some cases are easy. And as you said, settlement expansion, there's no secret. It's all, as far as Israel is, by the books. And house demolitions, I think, is also the case. Who signed the order? The name is on the demolition order. And the legal advisor that comes to the High Court of Justice and defends this policy, and the judges that give the stamp of approval, I would think that all of them would have it would give them pause that the ICC is looking into crimes committed in the West Bank.
Well, I think we're going to stop there. This is so helpful. I suspect we'll want to invite you back again. Well, we will for sure on any number of topics. But as this particular case comes to some kind of conclusion, I want to thank you, Jessica, so much for joining me today, and thanks for sharing your insights with the foundation and our listeners. Lot to look at here. I would encourage people to check out the Hamoked website, www.hamoked.org, and also check out the article published by the Associated Press. The headline is "Palestinian Mom Fights to Stave Off Punitive Home Demolition." Very powerful. For our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And I want to remind you, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. That way you don't miss anything. We're adding new content pretty much every week. And you can also find the podcast and the video from the podcast at www.fmep.org. And with that, we will end this. I'm Laura Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.